Hello, my name is Charlotte Norwood and I'm here to discuss part of my research project, Melancholic Cryptonymy and the aesthetic threshold of detectability. The project looks at the technology of melancholic neurosis from the perspective of psychoanalysis and through the work of Ryan Gander's Blue Conceptualists, the haunted painter Vanessa Disler, and the CGI cadavers in the video work of Ed Atkins. So to briefly talk about melancholia, the lost object, and the crypt, the Hungarian psychoanalysts Nicholas Abraham Maria Torek, who after Freud and after Derrida re-examine and distinguish the process of incorporation in melancholia as being inaccessible to the gradual and assimilative work of mourning. So in the work of mourning, what is known in psychoanalysis as the lost object undergoes the process of introjection, wherein over time the object once lost is gradually replaced, whereas the process of incorporation denies this replacement, it denies this loss, whereby the lost object is what Derrida calls internally vomited into the subject, forming a psychic crypt in which the lost object is swallowed and preserved. So the crypt is described as a kind of tomb or vault that, being harboured by the not fully confronted phantoms, is both full and empty at the same time. And at the heart of this psychic architecture, they decide is a space of burial, but one whose inhabitant, having not been accorded proper burial rites, is not quite dead and not quite alive. So this results, the phantom here results not from the return of the repressed, but from the cryptic inclusion of another, in which the work of mourning has been rendered ineffective. And to describe the crypt, they use a barrage of architectural metaphors such as enclaves, partition walls, barriers, and quite beautifully describe it as like the inside walls of a pyramid that's covered in hieroglyphics that are visible, but they cannot be read. It's inscrutable. So signalling the existence of the crypt is the presence of cryptonyms, and these are hidden words spoken by the subject. And these words usually are in their form material fragments, remainders, linguistic disjecture, and these cryptonyms act as a visceral linguistic form of resistance or of matter and challenge the expectation that language can provide clarity. So these are then relayed through anagrams, homophones, rhymes and puns, clusters of associations that grow and link to others and can continually feed each other in a very linguistic way. So it's like the idea of the neurotic always speaking code, even to him or herself, and how these patterns of transmission are reactivated, re-encrypted, and perpetuated through the subject's compulsive behaviour. The notion of repetition in melancholic neurosis, as it serves as the technology that generates and sustains the crypt, is quite intrinsic here. So trauma bequeaths repetition, and the operation of the psychic crypt repetitively works through a process of marking and erasing, revealing and concealing. So where the object is replaced in the process of introjection, the notion of mourning is finite, but in the process of incorporation, the melancholic becomes trapped in a scrambled overlay of fractured temporalities, forced into a confrontation with the notion of infinity. So this is what Blanchot calls non-contemporaneity. And in his writing in his book, The Writing of the Disaster, he deems the only response to this encounter with affinity is a kind of abject surrender to repetition. Trauma bequeaths repetition. So the aspect of hauntology to listen to the relics of the future and the unactivated potentials of the past correlated with Walter Benjamin's thought on the progression of history. So he famously talks about the angel of history moves forwards, facing backwards. So we can progress and we can make new things, but it's always in view and in light of everything that's already happened. And then looking at Vico's thought on the eternal recurrence, I felt that he he contextualized Walter Benjamin's saying quite well, because he sees the model of history as like an auto-cannibalistic feedback loop that reiterates and sustains itself endlessly by living out its own death. So for example, you have a novel like James Joyce's avant-garde novel Finnegan's Wake, and it's this radically new thing, but is a whole archaeology based on everything that's already happened, right back to the Anglo-Saxons. So melancholic aesthetic practices, I think, here are akin to the technology of the crypt. It's not about progression, it's about regression. It's about modes of recycling. It's not about going forwards, it's about going round. So to look at my first artist, this is Ryan Gander, and I'm going to be talking about his project The Locked Room Scenario, which he stages the exhibition Field of Meaning by his fictional collective movement, the Blue Conceptualists. And this took place in a warehouse called London Newcastle in London in 2011. So the Blue Conceptualists quite obviously play the role of the melancholic here. The conceptualists are blue. They have a strong presence in the exhibition, but as they are a fictional movement, they are neither dead nor alive. And given the notion of barriers involved in melancholia in the crypt, there's this feeling in the exhibition that you're giving free rein to explore. You can go outside of the warehouse, you can go into different rooms, but the viewer will always purposely be denied some form of access. So here, for example, there are boxes with notes. Are you allowed to open the notes? Probably not. There's barriers here signalling that you're not to go through that space into the corridor. So also in the corridor, there is a window that looks into another room. So there's a door to this other room, but you can't go in it. But there's a window that's showing part of this exhibition. And also there's this blue kind of sculpture that's hidden by another wall. And of course, we're only looking at part of the show through a window that's hidden by a blind. And you can go outside the warehouse, and then you find there's like this skip, and you find the same blue material from the sculpture of all these these fragments and material leftovers that the artist didn't use for the sculpture that is on display in the exhibition. So with fragments and cryptonyms, the whole exhibition is entirely made up of visual fragments, scraps of notes, boxes, leftover artwork. You can only see part of the artwork through windows. There's definitely a deliberate frustration. So here's an example of some working notes that are on display. But these constructed objects act like cryptonyms, hiding the fact that they are devoid of meaning and cannot point to resolution. They will not grant an answer to whether certain objects are predetermined or not. And it's important to note here that the fictional exhibition Field of Meaning is hidden within Ryan Gander's own exhibition, The Locked Room Scenario. So repetition here is basically a constant repetition of clues disguised in different forms. You have graffiti outside, boxes of postcards, working notes, seating plans for the exhibition dinner. And these empty signifiers, like I said before, are constantly disguised as possible clues. And to touch on hauntology, the Blue Conceptualists were, in the press release, say they were a fictional movement in the 1970s, and this is their comeback exhibition or their retrospective in what was then the present in 2011. So the exhibition appears to be unfinished. I'll just put that back up. So here the exhibition appears to be unfinished and in the process of closing while still being open to the public. So there is this melancholic overtone of having given up on the exhibition and giving on the future. That is the retrospective. The second artist I'd like to talk about is Vanessa Disler. And I'm going to be looking at her collection of paintings called Shadow Work and the exhibition Unfinished Business. And during this time, her practice revolved around her finding out she had a deceased older relative who happened to be a successful painter working in a similar style. And since then, she's described feeling haunted by his practice and uses this trauma as part of her own working experience. Part of her own working process, rather. So here, I think the artist plays the role of the melancholic, while her deceased relative is the figure of the ghost. That is neither dead or alive. I mean, is dead, but his presence is having an impact on her work. in the present, basically. So here we have a painting on a shower curtain that privatizes a certain space against another. And just to show you the other side of the image. Yeah, it's a division between different spaces of public and private. We have a shower curtain against the aesthetic use of hay barrels that suggest an outside. And also in her work, she uses a lot of language, and the language is usually mirrored or written into the paintings. It's sort of written backwards, but she constantly uses the motif of the letter V and the letter M, Vanessa and Martin. Martin Disler is her deceased relative. And these are the only letters that are legible when written backwards. So it's this idea that Vanessa and Martin are somehow functioning together in this realm and the realm of the deceased, a sign they're haunting each other. And also here we have the use of the colour black in the motifs of the moon phases, and they appear like portals into another realm. So concerning fragments and cryptonyms, fragments of words are constantly written backwards and mirrored, even though the viewer can make them out, they are intended to be read from the other side. So also, as Martin Disler was Swiss German, these words also fluctuate between English and German. And the word vergessen is something that is used quite often. This is only part of the word vergessen, which in English is to forget. And the word ritual is used and Disler is used. And concerning repetition, it was this ritual and vergessen, to forget, is repeated, acting as a continual reminder to forget, as even if when she's performing this ritual, she's still distracted by his haunting of her. Like to write to forget is not forgetting. And she talks a lot about of continually attempting to haunt him in death, to return his haunting. And also back to the image of the three paintings, we have this monthly cycle of the moon, the notion of tides and of time passing, and this esoteric idea of waiting. So the painter is in a position of being haunted by a past that is not her own. She's haunted by her dead relative, who is basically influencing her work, influencing her painting at the present. And so move on to my last artist, Ed Atkins. So Ed Atkins used a lot of CGI figures that function as both the melancholic and the ghost, is neither dead or alive. They're usually emoting, they're in existential crisis, but they're technology produced. They are cadavers, though. They're dead, but they're not. They are dead, but they're also not alive, because again, they're also fiction. So there's always this already absent present, and there's a really good shot here of this is part of a video where the boy has been thrown through this hole, and you have this kind of vomit, and he's going to play this melancholic tone on the piano. And I like the idea that he was like incorporated into the crypt, and this is the residue of the eternal vomit, the residue from the eternal vomiting of the subject. But the videos are also freestanding objects themselves, blocking windows, and then you have this display of racks of costumes that appear to be taken from the video games and give a feeling of being backstage. So they act like a source code or an analog material, where the back of the theatre and the wiring is being put on display. We're being shown what's on the screen and what's behind it. Fragments and cryptonyms in the videos, the figures are nonsensical, talking in code, lost in psychosis. And there's again this material presence of tears and distress and the vomit I showed you before on the previous clip. Repetition, so for example, we can't see it in this still, but that same boy that I showed before is constantly running around the piano. So the video game itself resists closure anyway, that you have a set of characters who are in a fixed oppressive universe where there's only a certain number of paths, events and actions that are possible, and you're always going to lose. The boy is continually running around circles around the piano, the figures are continually repetitively talking in a psychotic language, and they appear to be pining for an escape out of repetition, but this is not granted. So again, the medieval setting, we're looking at hauntology, the medieval setting, the old clothes, the symbolism of the piano, this mise-en-scene is created completely by way of new technologies. And the technology in the videos, how this has all come about is through completely a new form of technology. But in the videos, the technology in the videos are new via the subject of regression. We're going back to the Middle Ages. We're going back to looking at the motif of the piano. The clothes are old. It's talking about a period. It's a subject of a period that is completely destroying the technology that is allowing it to happen. So just as a conclusion, although cryptonyms act as a visceral linguistic form of resistance or matter, challenging the expectation that language provides clarity, an aesthetic threshold of detectability into melancholic cryptonymy can be found through the repetitive technological operation that generates and sustains a psychic crypt. So this is again through marking and erasing, revealing and concealing. And in the question concerning technology, Heidegger describes the possibility that all productive manufacturing lies in revealing, that the production of technology is therefore not a means, but a form of revealing. Technology reveals what it conceals, and there's a concealment of this revealment. There's this ongoing double move and quite gnostic process that's always infinitely regressive. So melancholic practices, I then see melancholic aesthetic practices, therefore, as technology in that respect. So like the operation of the psychic crypt, they also function via indirection, encrypted transmissions and indirect speech. And as a mode of visual contemporary art, already cryptic by nature, contemporary art requires a deconstructive gesture, which shows that the impossibility of the reading can actually be decrypted through techne. So for Aristotle, techne, aesthetics, is what we sense and how we sense them. And what the psychoanalyst essentially does is decode. So Freud looks at what the subject is not saying, but the way linguistic disjecture and cryptonyms have re-encrypted and mutated over time. And the crypt's double technological move of marking and erasing, like the process of melancholic artistic practice, opens up the space of the creative work itself. Its retroactive movements of revealing and concealing become those of reading and writing, making and interpreting. So here they underwrite these works and the technology of the crypt completely underwrite the creative process, not the analytical one. They reenact, repeat, and escalate the symptom, not on the side of the cure, but of the pathology, of the psychoanalytic dream. It's the alien that's inside the subject. So again, melancholic aesthetic practices, like the technology of the psychic crypt, are not about progression. Or they move forward through progression, but it's more about moving in loops. Again, this Walter Benjamin notion of the angel of history moves forwards, facing backwards. And with that in mind, and from this perspective, I think, historically speaking, we don't advance into new ground, but over old ground, more consciously, with nuanced understanding. So, thank you.